Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes him pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's fact. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome to episode 162 of the Last Round Podcast. And today I have boxing analyst and commentator you've probably heard on ESPN, Box Nation, CBS, NBC. He's also a boxing writer for Boxing Scene. The special guest is Corey Erdman. Thanks for joining me, Corey.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I know, we had a couple snafus in making this happen, but I've been looking forward to this. So, and it's just you and me today too. So I feel like I get more of you. This is excellent.
No, exactly. You were a man in demand.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, Dan Canobio's show a few weeks back, right?
I think so. Yeah, me and Dan go way back. I guess through Broadway boxing when he was breaking in on the broadcast side. So I never say no to him, and definitely not going to say no to you guys.
Before we jump into the fight reviews and previews, if you could just give people kind of a lowdown, like how you started in the boxing game, who you followed, growing up.
Yeah, for sure. So I have basically been writing and calling fights within boxing basically since I was 18, and I'm 33 now. I'm turning 34 in a week or so. Basically, I grew up kind of around boxing. I grew up in Kitchener, Ontario, in Canada, and my grandfather was best friends with Arnie Beam, who was Lennox Lewis's trainer through his amateur career and then the early portions of his pro career as well. So I was always around boxing and around the boxing gym, and from an early age, I just started devouring boxing history and any fight that I could get my hands on, and just piles of VHSs and going to the local library and printing out old newspaper accounts of fights, and just really immersed myself in it. And when I was 18, I got an opportunity to call my first fight, and around that time, I also got a gig at a magazine at the very same time, and I was put on Sirius XM radio at the same year, and I kind of had this just blast off of a start to my journalistic career on all mediums, kind of all at the same time, and now that's the only thing I've ever had to do. So basically, since then, yeah, I have at some point basically worked for every major outlet and kind of continue to this day. And every Monday I write the lead story for Boxing Scene as well, and write for some other outlets. But I've been one of the lucky ones to effectively been able to make a living in boxing and boxing exclusively for the vast majority of my life.
So have you met, and were you around Lennox Lewis when you were young?
Yeah, I don't have like super vivid memories of it, but I do know, from what my family was told, that there were definitely moments when I was kind of rolling around on the floor in my grandpa's basement, and a young Lennox was there. And we've obviously seen each other and worked together since, so we kind of laugh about it now. But yeah, I don't remember it vividly, but definitely all of that. A lot of that stuck, and I think that because of kind of how obsessive I was about it when I was a kid, when you're a kid, you kind of retain information. Like when you look back at the things you were obsessed with when you were younger, whether it was cars or toys or whatever, you knew everything about that particular thing. And I never let that go. And so when I was 18, I kind of had this base of knowledge that people around my age didn't have. And I think it just gave me kind of a leg up in an industry that was hiring mostly older people at that time, but I was able to kind of hang from an early age and then hang on, I guess, even to this day.
For people listening that want to kind of follow your footsteps into the boxing scene, do you think going to a gym and kind of immersing yourself in the boxing scene, hanging with fighters and trainers, kind of helped you break in and stay in the boxing scene and to be able to earn a living, which is, hard in boxing?
It is, yeah. And I think that, in my case, I got really lucky with kind of just getting a break in like the very early days of webcasts, getting to call something, and then kind of, being hired by a television network when I was that young. I kind of had a lot of lucky experiences earlier on. Now, I think it is a lot easier, although maybe harder to make a living out of it. But it's easier to be able to call a fight when you're young because there's so many fights that are streaming everywhere. And I think that if you do want to do this, take those opportunities if you can. As many reps as you can get calling fights, it's definitely going to help you down the line, especially when you're calling fights involving fighters that might not have a well-documented backstory, and you have to go out and get that information and learn it. That's just going to make you a better broadcaster. But to your question about whether immersing yourself in boxing and in the gym is a good thing, I think absolutely. And that's not to say that you need to be a former fighter or you need to go and spar to be a good boxing writer or a good commentator. But I think one way or another, it will help you in whatever you do to better understand what this sport is like. I think it'll help your comprehensive understanding as far as what's happening in the ring. I think it'll make you a more empathetic broadcaster and writer because you have physically been in there and you understand what fighters go through and what their lives are like. So I think that, and lastly, I think it just generally makes you more curious about every fight. I think a lot of boxing discourse today is just kind of like, it's business talk about like, what fight will this then set up? If so-and-so wins, what will this then lead to? And oftentimes you're missing a lot of really fascinating stuff, not just bell to bell, but then in the fighters' lives. And so by just kind of being around and interacting with fighters and seeing what they do, I think that it will make you a lot more curious. And I think that the more curious you are, the better that you're going to be at this job.
You said you called your first fight at 18. What fight was it?
My first fight was the main event was Troy Ross versus Carl Handy. It was at Casino-Rama in Orillia, Ontario, and it was on secondsout.com. And whatever I was promised to get paid for it, I didn't get paid a single dollar, but I didn't care because I got a free room at a casino and I got to go and call a fight by myself. I didn't have a color commentator with me. And lo and behold, a lot of the work that I do now is rooted in that. I do a lot of solo calls and I really enjoy doing that. So even though I didn't get that $500 or whatever, I like to think that I profited from it down the road.
And going into something like that, did you practice by watching old fights? How did you get the reps in?
Yeah, if I remember, I'm pretty sure that's exactly what I did. I think I would put a fight on and mute it and kind of do the commentary myself, the way that I thought that it would sound, or the way that I thought, I would call a fight. And looking back at it, when I was a kid, I was big into professional wrestling too, right? I love pro wrestling and I had action figures. And when you have the action figures, you're kind of putting your own matches together and you're simulating them with these toys, and you're also the color commentator. And so the same thing, when I was in my basement and I was either boxing on the heavy bag or like wrestling with pillows and stuff you do as a kid, I was also calling those things, right? I was the color commentator as well. And so I hate to say like anything was like predetermined in my life or anything like that, but looking back, it's kind of what I was always doing. I was always sort of acting as a color commentator and always consuming boxing that way by listening to how it was called and the stories being told. And it just kind of stuck with me. I think that, I did have some degree of kind of natural talent for it, but that's not to say, that I haven't and continue to work very hard at it. But I do think that there was something in me from a young age that just really wanted to be the voice, the guiding voice track over these things that I was watching.
Who was the first boxer you actually interviewed?
Oh, okay. Let me think. I actually don't remember who it would be. I do remember that the first, boxing story that I ever wrote for a major outlet was for the Sporting News, and I was probably around that age. And I remember it being about Jorge Arce. And I remember talking to him and Larry Merchant and a variety of other people for that. He might not have been the very first boxer that I ever interviewed, but that was the first kind of like, I got a cool writing gig for a cool outlet at that time. And I got to talk to real people like that. That's the first one that I remember. And kind of the first time I remember seeing my name on the byline and thinking, this is kind of cool. This feels for real now.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, I need to bring you back and just do a Corey Erdman life story. I think.
I haven't thought about this stuff for a long time, so
right,
I'm enjoying this.
So many questions.
Yeah.
We better jump into the fight reviews before we get sidetracked so much and it ends up being like a 3-hour episode.
Yeah.
So Saturday the 29th from the Packard Music Hall, Warren, Ohio. Alinga Maccabi moved to 29-2 with a split decision victory over, you can probably correct me on this, is it Thabisil Munchu?
Yeah, Tabizo Machunu. Yeah.
There we go. 23-6. This was for the WBC Cruiserweight. I know that you obviously watched this because you did your piece in the boxing scene. What did you think of the fight, Corey? And did you think the decision went the right way?
I thought it was a pretty good fight, and I did not think that the decision went the right way. I thought it was a pretty clear decision for Machunu. I thought that kind of 8-4 seemed pretty sensible, and that's not a slight to Junior Makabu or anything like that. I thought, it was a good competitive fight. I didn't think that Makabu was anywhere near as good as he was in his recent outings. He looked a little more sluggish. That said, I thought that Machunu looked like a very improved fighter with a better game plan, better timing. It was a little sharper. But I thought the decision went not just the wrong way, but the scorecards were basically the inverse of the fight that I watched. And I think that was the consensus on boxing Twitter and, wherever else people talk about boxing and share their opinions. I didn't see too many people who felt that Makabu deserved that decision. And the bizarre thing about that is that one of the judges that scored it, in my opinion, incorrectly, was Steve Weisfeld, who is generally regarded. A lot of people like to call him, the best boxing judge out there, one of the most trustworthy boxing judges. And I just thought he got it wrong. And by the way, I also thought he got it wrong in the co-feature when he scored Trevor Bryan, Jonathan Guidry, 115-112 for Jonathan Guidry. And I love Jonathan Guidry. I profiled him as well. I was, quietly kind of rooting for him, rooting for the underdog in this one. But I did not think that 115-112 Guidry was appropriate in that fight either. So it was just kind of a strange night and kind of a strange. It's odd when someone with Weisfeld's reputation kind of winds up being the main character of the night when we're talking about bad decisions, because you see it, I think, less often with him than with other judges.
We kind of just spoke about it, about being predetermined fights. Do you think the fact that Makabu was spoken about so much, fighting Canelo at some point this year, do you think that's maybe why the scorecards went in his direction, because he was kind of the A side?
Listen, it's like I don't ever want to be caught up in like a libel lawsuit, right? But I understand why people would think, and that's kind of what I was getting at in my piece that was up on Boxing Scene on Monday, and you can go back and read it as well. But people's minds are obviously going to travel there for a variety of obvious reasons, mainly being that it's a Don King production. And I think that there is a general feeling of distrust when it comes to anything involving Don King. I think that there's a general feeling of distrust, when it comes to sanctioning bodies, or when there's a lot of money on the line, in this case, involving the biggest fighter in the sport in Canelo Alvarez. And so if you're a fan and you're watching, I can understand why you would think, oh, well, this decision was just meant to protect the money and keep it in-house and make sure that the previously agreed upon fight between Makabu and Canelo is still potentially on the table. I'm not saying that is what happened, but if you believe that to be the case, there are a lot of reasons why you could think that way.
Which is interesting because, I think it was the report came out this week that, PBC had offered him a fight against Charlo and then nothing for September. And then obviously Matchroom and DAZN had offered him Bivol and then Triple G.
Right.
So if he takes that one, then when's the Makabu fight going to be? Is he going to fight 3 times and fight again in December?
Yeah, I mean, and who knows? And this may not be a this year thing, but definitely if you're Don King, I mean, this is your golden ticket, right? I mean, that may be the last major fight he ever promotes. It's a potential for his fighter to defeat the biggest draw in boxing. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if you're him, you're going to hold on to that at all costs. And so she is incredibly happy, I'm sure, on Monday morning that Makabu was victorious, and that's still potentially on the table for him.
True, that's true. And then the heavyweight match on this card, Trevor Bryan moved to 22-0 with another split decision over Jonathan Guidry, who dropped to 17-1 and 2. And this was for some kind of WBA trinket, the WBA heavyweight. Did you believe this one went in the right direction? Because there was a few people on Twitter and Facebook saying they thought Jonathan Guidry did enough to actually sneak it.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I thought the decision did go the right way. I thought, again, like I thought 115, 112 for Guidry was I didn't think that was accurate. And I'd only heard one person who thought that Guidry maybe had edged it. So I'm surprised to hear that other people thought that Guidry won that fight as well. But to be honest, I hadn't seen that myself. I thought that Guidry probably surprised a lot of people with his performance in this one. I mean, this is a guy that took the fight on a month's notice. He works full-time on a shrimp boat and full-time on a crab fishing boat. Prior to this, he was just working full-time and didn't have the time or the resources to train. Gets a call to fight for, again, asterisk here, a version of a heavyweight title, however you want to define it, and steps in and put on a pretty good performance. Like I didn't think he deserved the decision, but I thought that he was very tricky countering to the body. I thought that he gave Bryan more problems than he probably expected, but I thought that Bryan deserved the decision, but also didn't necessarily convince anyone of his ability to beat, forget someone like a Fury or a Joshua or an Usyk or anything like that, but I don't think he convinced anyone on Saturday that he could even beat Daniel Dubois, which seemingly is what could be next for him. So I thought an appropriate decision, but not necessarily an impressive one for Trevor Bryan.
No, very true. I think the Daniel Dubois fight will be a good one, and it looks like it should be next. Even though the WBA spoke about trying to get rid of all these regular titles, gold titles, we still seem to have the super and the WBA heavyweight in the heavyweight division at the minute.
Yeah, I think, there has been an amalgamation of some of the titles, but some of them, again, still linger. And especially when Don King is involved, magically, weird things, again, tend to happen when he's involved as well. But, again, from the outset, the WBA saying that it was going to get rid of all these titles, it was in response to a lot of other, less savory things that were going on with the organization at that time. And I think that it was a lot of a distraction to say, okay, some bad stuff is happening. Mainstream media is picking up on some really greasy things that are happening with our organization. So to placate people, I'll tell you what, we're only going to have one champion in every division. We're going to work towards that. And although they have gotten rid of certain titles, they're still kind of stuck in the past in a lot of cases. So they're not really living fully up to the promise that they'd made to the boxing public.
Right. We complained about at the IBF and stuff like that because they do sometimes come up with some ridiculous mandatories, but they do stick to the rules. That's one thing about the IBF. They do stick to what they say.
Right. Yeah. I guess that is true. Yeah. They make sure that they're going to get their money one way or another.
Yep. Moving on that weekend to the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Tulsa, Oklahoma on ESPN. Robson Conceição moved to 17-1 with a unanimous decision 10 over Xavier Martinez, who dropped to 17-1. What did you think of Robson Conceição's performance?
I thought he looked great, and he had that little kind of scare in the third round where it looked like Martinez might have wobbled him, but then he really stabilized, and a nice bounce back performance from him after that Valdez fight. And now what's interesting is this is kind of that was a Top Rank debut for Xavier Martinez, and Top Rank kind of cleaned house a little bit in recent weeks and in recent months, kind of getting rid of some guys that were sort of one-loss guys and whatnot. And I'm curious sort of what the plan is now for Xavier Martinez after losing to Conceição. Do they want to now rehabilitate Xavier? Do they kind of move him down the card a little bit? I'm interested to see sort of what his trajectory was going to be, or was this kind of a make or break fight, and whoever wins it is going to be the one that that is paid attention to by Top Rank? Or do they see something in Xavier Martinez, even despite this loss? That's kind of what's interesting to me moving forward coming out of this fight.
Were those releases to make room for all the Team USA people they signed? Do you know?
Yeah, I could see that being the case because when you want to sign guys that are coming out of the Olympics, I mean, everyone's trying to sign those guys. So you tend to have to give them either higher guarantees, higher bonuses. So I could absolutely see that being the case. But now that they're on the roster, does that mean that, hey, if you start taking a couple losses, how on what kind of ground are guys on the top ranked roster now after they made those big signings?
Yeah. They found some good talent, Keyshawn Davis and those guys are looking good.
Yeah, and this undercard was actually quite interesting for that. They had Shushu Carrington and I'm not going to put Nico Ali Walsh in that category, but he was on there as well. Jeremiah Milton, a good looking heavyweight prospect, obviously. Haven Brady out of Toledo was on that card, and Stephen Shaw, who beat Joey DeVaco. I've called a lot of Shaw's fights because he came up through the Broadway boxing kind of pipeline with Lou DiBella before signing this agreement with Top Rank. And that's an impressive stoppage victory for DeWaco. And Stephen Shaw is in the best shape of his career. I think he's an above average puncher, if not better, in the heavyweight division. And he's got some tricky skills. So I'm interested to see Shaw against a kind of top 15 guy in the coming months and years as well.
You think he'll be moved quickly?
I could see that. I guess, how do we define quickly? Because the top of the division is it's so crowded, or it's top heavy. I shouldn't say crowded, but where does Stephen Shaw go? even in 1 year's time, is he going to get a world title shot? Not necessarily. So what I could see is maybe kind of taking Shaw through the tour of the guys who have recently lost in world title fights, so veterans, some recognizable names, and getting his name out there. And I think for him, that is kind of moving relatively quickly in relation to his previous career. But he's only 29 years old, and that's plenty young in the heavyweight division. So yeah, I think that probably the next step for him is, top 15, top 20 guys who are maybe on the descent in their careers, but still present a threat and present some name value as well.
Interesting. It's always interesting the way they maneuver people.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Moving on to the fight previews. Saturday, the 5th of February, Motorpoint Arena, Cardiff, Wales on Sky Sports. We have Chris Eubank Jr. back, 31-2 against Liam Williams, 22-3-1. What sort of waves has this made over in the US? I live in the US, but I follow a lot of the UK boxing, so it may be different for me.
Yeah, it's obviously with Claressa Shields on this card, it has been getting attention in the press. And I should say as well that in the United States, if you order this pay-per-view, I'm the host of this pay-per-view as well. So I guess this is part of my research as well. So I'll be hosting this one, but the commentary that you will get will be the same feed that you would get on Sky Sports and with the Boxer feed. But I'll be hosting this one. I think Claressa has brought a lot of attention and always brings some mainstream attention in the United States. In the UK, the face-off between Liam Williams and Chris Eubank Jr. and Chris Eubank Jr.'s jacket during that were phenomenal. That's terrific promotion. And obviously this one has been rescheduled a number of times. And I think the last 3 Chris Eubank fights have been rescheduled. So you kind of got a feel for him a little bit. So this one has had some time to simmer and build a little bit. So I'm interested to see how this will perform on pay-per-view here. It's also being streamed by ppv.com, pay-per-view.com, which is owned by In Demand, kind of the largest traditional pay-per-view provider in the United States and in North America. So they're trying to kind of get in there and compete with Fight on the streaming end, as more and more people just don't order regular pay-per-views. They would order them in a digital sense. So I think this is kind of a dipping their toes into the water kind of moment for the company as a whole. And it's a nice card to start with.
Chris, do you think Chris Eubank Jr. is well known over in the US due to his time with the PBC?
I don't think so at all. No, people, I think in the United States don't, and I'm speaking generally. I mean, even his father, I don't think people have quite a grasp of how famous, but also how good he was. So I don't think that Eubank has really benefited from that name value, or even really from his time with the PBC in the way that you might think he does. Like, I think that he's, I won't say unknown, but that cachet, I think, for the average American fan just isn't here in the same way that it would be in the United Kingdom. It's really two different worlds.
I would agree with that. The problem I think his father never really traveled over here to fight.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, and perhaps, and clearly they have a good rapport, boxer trainer wise as well. But linking up with Roy Jones Jr. and kind of, becoming his latest protege and adopting some of his mannerisms in the ring as well, that's kind of maybe helping him get a little bit of press over here as well. But yeah, to your point, Eubank's career really had nothing to do with the United States. So Eubank's kind of connection to the American audience really, unless you're a hardcore boxing fan right now, is like he's the guy that Roy Jones is training. And that's kind of, I think, and he's ranked #1 in the middleweight division on BoxRec. So if you just go on the website, you might think, I wonder if this guy's pretty good. Maybe I should tune in. Maybe that helps him.
Where do you think the winner of this goes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's difficult to say just where people in that camp, let's say, with Boxer and Sky Sports, like, who can they do business with? I'm not sure where the obvious sort of pipeline is. Like, is it, if Eubank wins, let's say, can he make a fight with one of the PBC guys? Like, there are lots of people I would love to see the winner of this fight in with, like whether it's Lara or Jamal Charlo if he doesn't get the Canelo fight, or Jaime Munguia. Like, there are a lot of very interesting fights out there. But I think that the outlet that they're with is kind of new enough that I'm just not sure what's feasible. Who do they work well with? What are the actual pathways? Who could they maybe lure over to the UK to make that fight? It's kind of difficult to prognosticate where Eubank's career is going to go. And I'm using Eubank. It could be Liam Williams as well. But that's kind of been the case for Eubank for a really long time. He seems like a guy who's sort of been on the outside of whatever has actually been going on in whatever division he's in at that time for a little while. It's kind of like there's been the A storyline, and then Chris Eubank Jr. is kind of over here doing his thing. And I feel like he's sort of still in that spot, unless it proves that the people he's with right now are capable of doing business with people outside of that circle.
I'll throw two names at you, and you tell me if you think they're possible fights, and then also kind of, what you think of the fight.
Yeah.
Murata and Triple G for the winner.
Oh, I mean, that would be fantastic. Yeah. I mean, again, the issue there is Triple G and Murata both have ties to DAZN, and there's not the best relationship right now between DAZN and Sky Sports and kind of that whole camp. So would I love to see it? Yeah, that would be tremendous. And that's kind of the dream for Eubank, is to catch someone like a Murata or a Triple G, especially, maybe in the autumn of their careers, and get that kind of win. But again, I'm just not sure business wise if they can come together for that.
No, it's that across the street, they're on the wrong side of the street type of thing. It just ruins boxing.
Yeah, it's time and time again. It definitely doesn't help us.
Touching on the co-main, Clarissa Shields against Emma Kozin for the WBC, WBA, IBF, and I had to check this, the WBF. BoxRec actually put on the WBF. I didn't know they actually put that on there as a title.
Well, I mean, BoxRec is the chronicles of our sport. I will say, and by the way, this is not me like endorsing more like additional titles or anything like that. But when it comes to women's boxing and people who've like really, solidly followed women's boxing for many, many years, probably know this. Titles like the WBF and the WIBA, sometimes fights for those titles are actually better title fights than you see, say, for a WBC title sometimes. Like, these, before the WBC or the IBF cared at all about women's boxing, these little sanctioning bodies were the ones that were actually putting trinkets on the line that made the best fights in women's boxing. And when you look at the fights that Emma Kozin has had, like with this, that particular title on the line, like against Maria Lindbergh, like she's had decent fights because of these kind of minor titles in the past. So yes, it is not a major title, but those titles actually do serve a purpose within the women's realm. And Emma Kozin actually got some good publicity in ESPN this past week. She was named one of the potential rising stars in women's boxing. She has a cool backstory where she's going for a mathematics degree at the same time that she's also a pro boxer. Listen, is she likely to win this fight? No, but I think that if she puts up a decent fight against Claressa Shields, I mean, you look at the people that Shields has fought so far, all of those, I mean, a lot of them have then gone on to profitable ventures thereafter. If you can put up a decent fight against Claressa, if you can go the distance, it still sets you up for other opportunities. So I think that there's a bit of a cushion here for Kozin, that winning isn't necessarily everything here, but even fighting Claressa, getting this opportunity, getting this exposure, and then potentially performing well, I think can set her up for some decent things down the road.
It's probably kind of mean to say this, but this is kind of like Claressa Shields' showcase in the UK.
Of course.
Yeah, to prepare, her for, and probably, I'm sure Savannah Marshall will be there. They'll probably do some kind of head-to-head. They'll have some kind of argument, and then what would you say is the biggest women's fight? Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano, Claressa Shields, Savannah Marshall.
Oh gosh, it's really hard to say. I mean, they're kind of equals in a way. I would say that, I mean, only because we know where it is and the stakes and whatnot. Like Serrano and Taylor headlining at Madison Square Garden, and it being kind of the first women's fight of that magnitude. I mean, it is the bigger fight right now, but once they actually sign the contract for Shields, Savannah Marshall, maybe I would think differently. But Shields is in there with Taylor and Serrano as the three best women's fighters on the planet. They've completely changed the perception of women's boxing. They've changed how it's covered, who covers it. And so, I hate to even pick between the three, but I mean, right now, as it stands, Taylor Serrano is the biggest fight in the history of women's boxing, and that's the one that presently we know exists and is actually going to happen.
True, that's very true. It's funny though, when I saw the WBF, it just brought me back to like James Toney, Ricky Hatton.
Oh yeah, like the WBU title. Remember in the Fighter when they made like Mickey Ward's like the grand finale is him winning the WBU title, and they pretended it was a world title. I think they might have done that in Bleed for this too with Vinny Paz. They just kind of made these titles into actual world titles. It's made for Hollywood. It's perfect.
It's funny how they just drop off like that. Like you touched on the IBA. Those titles when I was growing up, you used to see many fighters with them. And then now you've just got, the main solid four, the WBA, WBO, IBF, and the WBC.
Yeah. I think you have to watch some really weird boxing to see some of those titles now. You gotta be watching the streams that Tim Boxeo is putting out there to see IBA title fights in 2022. I think I actually called an IBA title fight like a couple of years ago. Nico Hernandez fought for an IBA title, and my buddy Steve Smoger is still the guy who's in charge of like sanctioning everything at the IBA. So there's a little IBA background for all the title heads out there.
That's true. Yeah. What happened to Nico Hernandez? He broke his hand, right? Or no, he got shot.
Yeah, well, and he also had a brief stint in bare knuckle boxing as well. I to be honest, I don't have any inside info on what's happening with Nico, but I wish we would see him more often because he was a terrific talent and a wonderful backstory, and it just seems like his career has just been absolutely stalled. And I don't know if that's managerial or promotional or what it is, but when an Olympian decides that he's going to go and fight for BKFC when he still has world title prospect, like his previous fight, he was on DAZN, and then he hops over to fight in a bare knuckle fight against a guy who's never boxed before. Like something's going on. The opportunities for some reason are not presenting themselves for Nico Hernandez, and that's a shame.
I did wonder if it was because I think the show was in his backyard, right? It was I wonder if that was like the attraction.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And but again, like if he had actual like, six-figure prospects on the table in pro boxing, he never would have done that, right? You just would not take that kind of risk. So yeah, I think the fact that he was compelled to do that probably tells you everything you need to know about what's out there and in terms of potential opportunities for Nico right now. And that's not his fault. And it's too bad that that's the case.
I'll have to look into that after we finish this now. I'm
Yeah,
intrigued to see where he is.
Yeah.
Also this weekend, the Footprint Center in Phoenix, Arizona on DAZN. Carlos Cuadras, 39-4-1, goes up against Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, 14-0. This is going to be for the vacant WBC Superfly. I think this week, is it this week or the last 2 weeks, we've seen two of the best substitute fights I've ever seen. Obviously, Bam Bam stepping in for Rungvisai, and then obviously Julio Cesar Martinez stepping in for who was it? Juan Estrada.
Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. And that's how lucky for Matchroom and DAZN that they were able to lose two great fights and salvage them with people that were just hanging out and were otherwise on that card with two more great fights. It's fantastic. And it's in today's world, with boxing in a pandemic. I was talking to someone else about this today. Like, if you're a promoter, it's almost like just as a contingency plan, you ought to just stack your card with a variety of fighters in and around the same weight class, because this is just bound to happen. Yeah. And just from a financial perspective, like, you almost want, and promoters always do this to a certain extent, kind of have people on standby, but you really have to have guys that are like training for a fight, not just training in case they fight, but are on the cards so that you can make these swaps and save them. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. And not only is Rodriguez is he a great replacement? Maybe he wins this fight. Like, it's entirely possible.
No, he's a great talent. Going in against Cuadras, he's obviously going to be in against someone, massively experienced. Cuadras, this will be his 45th fight, where in terms for a Bam Bam, just his 15th. But we had, his brother on the show, Joshua Franco, and he even admitted, he says, Bam Bam's the talented one in the family.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and the professor is the studious one, right? Yeah, I just think that there's the potential, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but I think there's the potential that Bam is kind of catching Cuadras at exactly the right time, where Cuadras last fought basically 2 years ago, was in an absolute war with Juan Francisco Estrada, and Cuadras took a lot of punishment in that fight. And also in that fight, he physically was looking in serious distress at various times. And I don't know if, like, maybe at the time he was getting over a bout of COVID or he wasn't feeling well, but he was incredibly brave, and it was a heroic effort in that fight. But there were times when I was watching thinking, hey, he just doesn't look right. And maybe during this time he's recovered, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe that was kind of his last gasp. And we are kind of seeing the erosion of Carlos Cuadras, and Rodriguez will catch him at the right time. I think there's a real possibility of that. And if I were betting on this fight, I would absolutely lay some money on Rodriguez. I think that he's a terrific underdog bet in this fight, even though he's basically taking it on 1 week's notice.
Yeah, I agree with you. Me and Danny always say that you just can't back against a Robert Garcia fighter. The stable of fighters they have there, the sparring they have there, the youngsters being able to see like Mikey Garcia, Jose Ramirez, Jose Cita Lopez, just surrounded by talent.
Yeah, and you can't, like, guys in that gym are seldom going to come in unprepared, because they are just surrounded with such wonderful talent. There's my dog barking as I warned you about. Brownie, take it easy, buddy. Guys like that, like with that level of talent around, it's very difficult to come in unprepared. And Bam, and this speaks to that. On 1 week's notice, he's taking on a guy in Carlos Cuadras, who's one of those four kings in that division, right? One of the best fighters at 115 of the last generation, and he feels like he's capable of beating him. Yeah, that comes from that kind of preparation that you spoke about in that gym.
Do you think that the Superfly division and in and around that division as well, are getting a lot more eyes than it used to, because it used to be kind of like the forgotten division, when Chocolatito was coming up and, he was just one of the best fighters, but only us boxing geeks, us nerds, actually really knew about him. The casual didn't like those guys because they were like so small. But it seems to me now that it's changing.
It's absolutely changed. And now we're even seeing guys that are, 108, 105 getting TV time. And part of that, I think, is more exposure to these fighters. Part of it is that there's just more opportunities for fights to be broadcast. There's more outlets than ever before. Boxing is being broadcast more. There's more broadcast boxing than at any point in the history of humankind. So just generally, there are more opportunities for these fighters. But there really was a turning point, I think, when Chocolatito came to HBO, and suddenly people started paying attention to him because they knew, hey, that at one point he's considered the best fighter in boxing. So, okay, we better check out everyone else around him, because we need to start talking about this guy. We need to be curious about who he might fight. And that really changed things, because before Chocolatito to HBO and kind of everything that followed, we're talking about kind of, there are very brief stints where people paid attention to fighters in and around that weight. You had kind of that era when Mark Too Sharp Johnson was on Showtime, a period of time when Ricardo Lopez was sort of the opener on every pay-per-view. People started paying attention to 105, 108. And that's kind of it. Like there aren't too many in between there. And there have been wonderful fighters since then, but it's always been almost anything under 118. Well, that's something that happens outside of America. Like, we're not going to pay attention to that. So it has been a wonderful change. And I think that that stigma about, if they're under a certain weight, I can't pay attention to them, I think if in a general sense is gone from the general boxing fan these days.
No, yeah, I agree. It's good to see, because you watch some heavyweight fights and sometimes they get in there, they're out of shape, they hardly throw a punch. Whereas you watch these guys in the the superfly division, in and around there, they're throwing hundreds of punches around. So if you're a casual fan, it's those are the fights to watch.
Yeah, and it's always been weird to me, like, why people drew the line where they did, because the argument would always be like, oh, well, if these guys punched me, they wouldn't hurt me, which obviously is not true. Or like, oh, I only care about heavyweights, like that's the real best fighter in the world because he's the biggest and he can punch the hardest. But then they'd be cool with watching, welterweights. Like, where exactly do they draw the line on what's too small or not believable? Like, boxing is set up in such a way that people that are in and around the same weight fight one another. And to your point, more often than not, the lighter you go, sometimes the more exciting the fights are, because just a volume of punches. And also, the other thing is that sometimes when you have a slightly shallower talent pool, not in terms of like what the top level talent is, when you have fewer fighters, they tend to fight one another more often. We see that in women's boxing actually as well, but in the lower weight classes, there's less money on the table and there are just generally fewer fighters. So the best fighters tend to fight one another with more regularity than they do when you go up in weight. So for me, it's kind of been the opposite. I've almost been more intrigued by the lighter weight classes, because by and large, the quality that I get as a consumer has tended to be better.
Do you think, I don't like using that thing, the casual fan, but I'll have to, I guess, I can't think of another name. Do you think the casual fan, they look at it kind of like WWE, where they want the champions to be big, giants, colossal, Adonis-looking guys, and that's why they tend to, favor the heavyweights?
I think some people do have that mentality. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who only watch heavyweight boxing, right? Or maybe they draw the line, again at like 147 or something. It's always arbitrary, again, where that line is drawn. But yeah, I do think that there's that, and it's not rooted in fact, but yeah, there is that believability kind of aspect that, to your point, is kind of reminiscent of how people think of pro wrestling. Like, oh, that guy's not big enough. I don't believe that he's a real fighter. As if Chocolatito punched a person on the street that had never fought before that's 200 pounds, he's not going to knock him out. Of course he would. These are trained fighters who would absolutely torch anyone that doesn't know how to fight. So it's not rooted in reality. I think for some people, it's also just a good excuse to not have to follow anything additional. They're drawing the line somewhere. They're like, I'm only going to watch this amount of boxing, and this is as good as excuse as any to just not watch anything below like 122. I'm sure there are people out there like that too.
Moving on to another card that weekend from the Michelab Ultra Arena, Las Vegas, Nevada, on Fox pay-per-view. Keith Thurman is back, 29-1, faces Mario Barrios, who's 26-1. I actually do like this matchup due to the Keith Thurman not looking too good over the last few fights, been out of the ring for a long time. Mario Barrios coming in. Do you think he's catching Thurman at the right time?
I find this such a fascinating matchup for the reasons that you described. And one thing, that you have to compliment PBC for kind of as an entity is their ability to keep fighters relevant and not ever kind of like downgrade one of their fighters. Because like for a casual fan, we're going to use that term again. Let's, just a casual fan who isn't day in and day out following it maybe the way that you and I would. The last they saw of Mario Barrios, he's getting knocked out by Gervonta Davis, who's a lightweight. They met at 140. And now he's hopping up and he's facing Keith Thurman, who, casual fans, again, using that term, are very familiar with because he fought on network cable for years. And he's been a welterweight champion and contender for many years. This could look to someone who doesn't know any better like a bad matchup, but they have found a way to reutilize Mario Barrios in a way that gets him a great payday and in a way that I think appropriately tests Keith Thurman, who hasn't been in the ring for 2 years. To your point, last time we saw, lost to Manny Pacquiao, albeit, that's losing to a legend. Struggled a little bit with Josecito Lopez. That's maybe more of a red flag, I think, than the Pacquiao fight. That fight and the layoff is kind of what makes this interesting. But yeah, I like this fight too. And I think that, this is a good use of the roster members, I think, in the PBC camp.
Do you think if Keith Thurman loses, it's the last time we see him?
That's a good question. I don't know if he loses, if he's just going to like flat out retire in the ring. That's a tough thing to predict. But I do think that, if we're just on pure speculation, like Keith, I think, has had kind of a comfort level outside of the ring. He has interests outside of boxing. He's musically inclined and he's well read, and but that means something too. Like I think that there has been. He seems like a guy who is okay with identifying as something other than a boxer, and those people, I think, are maybe a little bit more prone to being okay with walking away with the sport and not having these long, drawn out careers where they get themselves hurt and they fight past, when it's profitable or safe for them. Keith doesn't strike me as one of those guys. And that's, to me, that's a compliment to Keith, knowing when to walk away and having interests outside of the ring. Like, that's all great. So yeah, is there the potential if he comes back and he just doesn't have it anymore? Can I see someone like Keith Thurman, from what I know of Keith Thurman, walking away? Yeah, I could see that potentially happen.
I do wonder who the PBC are going to throw at Jaron Ennis when they eventually give him that step up, because they have everyone in and around at that division. And, say if Keith sneaks through this, wins a very close points decision against Mario Barrios, and he looks kind of like he's on the way out. I do wonder, are they going to be like, Jaron Ennis is coming up the hill, keeps going down the hill. Now's the time to feed him that name.
I mean, I would love it. I would also love it if they just put the winner in with Boots too. Boots seems like a guy who, I felt he's been ready for a little while. He's, even when he was being named prospect of the year, he was kind of beyond being a prospect even at that point. So I win or lose, I would love to see him in against either of these guys. And yeah, and I don't think he necessarily, I think he's good enough that he doesn't have to take someone on the slide. I think he's good enough to just step in against one of the top guys at 47.
Yeah, it's intriguing to see who gets fed to him next, because I think he's going to reign this division for some time. We've got obviously him, Virgil Ortiz is another one, and then Conor Benn from the UK, who everyone seems to be backing. Give me your 1, 2, 3 of those, in who you think is going to be have the best career out of those three?
Oh gosh. Okay. Oh. Okay. I'm gonna go Boots, Virgil, Ben. But that's only because I think that I've seen more of both Boots and Virgil against slightly higher level opposition than I've seen Ben. But what Ben did to Algieri was extremely impressive. And if he had another one of those, if he had another Algieri type on his resume, I would say, then I would start having some thoughts. But Ben, I think, has really impressed me. And I think that he has, as Virgil Ortiz does, kind of next level power as well. I think he has kind of a special talent when it comes to his punching power as well. But for now, I'm going to rank them like that. I'm going to go Boots, Virgil, and Ben.
I would agree with that. I would do the same. I think Ennis just is an all-round good boxer. He's good going forward. He's also good defensively. Very rarely do you see him get tagged. I thought Virgil got tagged and looked a little bit vulnerable at times when he fought Kavalauskas. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And like, can you imagine Virgil versus Ben, right? I mean, they would never do this, but those two against one another right now would be awesome. Just two guys kind of with the same mindset and with the same superpowers, just battling it out would be amazing. I would love to see that. That's
maybe doable when a world title's on the line, obviously due to them both being Golden Boy and Matchroom, both being with DAZN at this minute. I don't know if the Golden Boy are going to stay there, but it looks that way. So yeah, I think, hopefully in a couple of years, later down the line when there's, one of them's holding a world title, that could be something we could see. Hopefully.
Yeah, and it's nice to kind of have this generation to be excited about in the same way that, Keith Thurman was kind of in this position. We remember that kind of back in 2014, 2015, maybe a little bit earlier than that, where, you had Thurman and Porter and Danny Garcia, like all these guys that were kind of coming up all around the same time, and they all really did pan out. And on that side of the bridge, they all fought one another. So hopefully that the same thing happens with the three names that we mentioned, that, in a couple of years, we'll be on here talking about those guys fighting one another and previewing those fights.
That's a good dream, Corey.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I that's all I can do.
Also on that card, returning Leo Santa Cruz, 37-2-1, goes up against Keenan Cabral, 23-2-1. More of a warm-up fight for Leo Santa Cruz just to get him back in the ring, do you think, Corey?
Yeah, it seems that way, and understandably, because that was a brutal knockout that Leo Santa Cruz suffered, and as a fighter and as people handling him, I think you do want to be a little bit careful with bringing him back. But Leo seems to want to jump right back in after this fight. Although there have been portions of his career where that's kind of been the storyline, right? Where he's asking for and talking about bigger fights, and then kind of taking these warm-ups kind of all the time. But I understand why they would do something like this with Leo, especially coming off a knockout as potentially life-altering as the one that he suffered at the hands of Tank.
After this one, do you see any kind of clear path for him?
It's tough to say, right? I don't know kind of what they're able to do with him, and where Leo wants to settle in at. Like, is he going to settle in at featherweight still? Is he going to move up or down? I really don't know, but I do know that Leo versus basically anyone is always going to be an exciting fight, and I'm happy to see it. But I'm not certain exactly what the path has been for him, because I've never been certain what the path is. Like, since those Frampton fights, like, it's always been up in the air. Like, is he going to move up or down? And then what happened with Tank happened. So it's really difficult, I think, to prognosticate the career of Santa Cruz right now.
When you look at his career on paper, though, he's had some career, hasn't he?
Oh yeah, it's been a terrific career, and really one of boxing's like just nicest guys. You really want to root for this guy. And I think that's afforded him, and understandably so, like a little bit of leeway with the boxing public when it's come to his schedule at times, because you've always got the sense that whatever Leo's competition has been like at the time. You've always sensed that he was more than willing to face better. And he has proven that when the opportunity has come up. And when he's been in the ring, he's always been a joy to watch. So, yeah, I totally agree with that.
He's by far one of the nicest guys I've ever met. I went to his gym one time, and first time I'd ever met him, he was super nice, signed some gloves and stuff for me. And then I was going to watch his fight. I think it was when he fought Abner Mares. His photographer was at the gym. He gave me some prints, like some really cool prints of like Leo knocking somebody out. He signed it for me. I was chatting to him for a while, and then I told him I was going to the fight, and he gave me a pass to like this suite that he had for the after party. And I'd met him that afternoon. And he just was so welcoming.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I mean, if you ever get the Leo Santa Cruz hookup again for the suite, just give me a call.
Right. And then also on that card, Luis Nery returns 31-1, and he's facing Carlos Castro, who's 27-0. Like a sneaky good matchup, just kind of towards the bottom of this card.
Yeah, arguably the show stealer, I think, of this card as well. I mean, two guys that could punch. I mean, we saw Castro last time out have a little bit of a scary moment against Oscar Escandón early before stopping him in the 10th. And Luis Nery, I mean, we know what he's all about. He was a stalwart in this division for many years, and then he just ran into an absolute buzzsaw in Brandon Figueroa, and no shame in that. I mean, that's someone that can grind anyone in and around his weight class down. But yeah, maybe catching Nery at the right time is Castro. I think that this is I said show stealer, but yeah, maybe the most intriguing fight on the card altogether. I could maybe label it that.
You always wonder if Luis Nery just got somebody in to help him with the weight.
I think he did, and we remember, of course, the drug testing issues that Nery had for quite some time, and I think that had to do with the weight as well. And you wonder if, again, like the weight was potentially problematic for him against Figueroa. Was he drained a little bit, and then the pressure that Figueroa was applying, did that eventually grind him down? Because he was ahead on one of the scorecards at that point, and he was even on another. And then just got dropped by a body shot. So is that going to be a continuing issue for him against Castro on Saturday? That remains to be seen.
Isn't it Nery that's banned from fighting in Japan because he missed weight so many times?
Yeah. And Japan takes that stuff seriously, man. Like if you, I'm trying to think. There was a fighter fairly recently, and I am going to. It wasn't Kohei Kono. There was a fighter recently that missed weight at like bantamweight in Japan, and they were just like, you cannot fight here for another 2 years. Oh, it's Daigo Higa. Yeah, Daigo Higa. They made him move all the way up to 118 from like 112 after missing weight. They said you can't fight within 2 weight classes of 112 because you missed weight. They do not mess around. So that's why Daigo Higa is fighting at 118, because he missed weight one time.
There you go. Eddie Hearn, everyone else, that's something to stop people missing weight, I guess.
Sure, yeah.
Moving on to the news and notes, and obviously the biggest news of this week, Tyson Fury's co-promoter, Frank Warren and Queensberry Promotions, won the right to the WBC heavyweight title between Tyson and Dillian Whyte with a bid of $41 million. Fury, the champion, will get $29.5 million. Whyte, the challenger, will get 7.3, and a bonus of 4.1 million will go to the winner, 10% of the winning bid per WBC rules. So what did you think, Corey? I think most people expected Eddie Hearn and DAZN to go in and blow them away with a bid. Well, obviously, Frank Warren and Top Rank seems to have teamed up and blew everyone else away with 41 million.
Yeah, and that's I guess I probably expected the same thing when you think about it. Top Rank, of course, has that the ESPN money behind it, and if they said to him, "Hey, we can have a exclusive rights to a heavyweight title fight involving Tyson Fury," I can see why they would slap down the money and make it happen. It's a monstrous amount of money, life-changing money for Dillian Whyte, just another gargantuan sum for Tyson Fury. I guess there's a little bit of a holdup now because Whyte still hasn't signed the contract, and I think he has until February 21st to do so. And now, some people are kind of suggesting that maybe he's holding out and whatnot. And I don't know the specifics of it. From what I can understand, it's something about, Dillian wanting exactly 20% of the purse. And I think maybe he's only getting 18% of what that purse is maybe at this point. That's kind of what I understand. I haven't looked fully into it. And if that's the case, I mean, I'm never one to judge fighters for holding out for more money, especially if they think that they're owed that money. And for Dillian Whyte, I mean, he's waited all this time. Why not hold out a little bit? And you've got till February 21st. If you think that'll get you an extra 2%, go for it. Like, I'm not going to make character judgments on Dillian Whyte, as I'm sure some people are, based on how quickly he signs this contract or doesn't. That's what fighters ought to do. Go get as much money as you possibly can.
I think what most people are wondering is 41 million before you've even staged the event, before you've paid the undercard.
Right.
And I think it's kind of common knowledge that they lost money on the Tyson Fury Deontay Wilder fights. How on earth are they going to recoup it?
It's a very good question. Yeah, I don't know, but I'm happy to see the fight. If someone wants to lose money over this fight, I'll still give them $74.99 to watch it, to go towards the losses.
One thing that, some of my friends and, asked me, how big do you think Tyson Fury is in the US? I was at the Swartz fight. I was at the Otto Wallin fight, and they weren't sold out, put it that way.
Right. Yeah. I like, he's not as big as Canelo, let's say. But I do think that he is pretty recognizable. And I know the past couple years, he's been among the most searched athletes in the world, for a variety of reasons. Like, Tyson does a very good job keeping himself in the headlines constantly. And part of that is because of, how obsessive the UK media is over covering top level boxers. And I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, everything that Tyson Fury says turns into a headline, and it keeps his name out there. So he's not as big as Canelo. Maybe but is he number 2 in the United States? I guess that's entirely possible. Maybe behind Jake Paul. That's kind of maybe where it's ranking right now.
And how about Dillian Whyte, the opponent? I'm sure over here he's probably not known at all, in fact.
Yeah, not in the same way. Again, like, the boxing audience, and we always kind of try and quantify it. Like, if you look at American TV ratings, like, most fights that would be on either premium or just broadcast cable tend to top out at 1.4 million viewers. Like, they go higher for pay-per-views and for unicorn kind of exceptional fights. They can obviously get higher, but your base audience of like people who will tune in for above average to top level fights, it's like 1.4 million. And almost any fight that you put on the air on an ESPN or somewhere else, like, usually does about 400,000. And then for showbox fights, it's less than that. But so your core audience is somewhere between 400,000 and 1.4 million people. So somewhere between that number is how many people know who Dillian Whyte is. I think that's the best way to answer that question.
So I'm going to guess that obviously it's going to be in the UK sometime in April, probably towards the end of April, on pay-per-view. Do you think it'll be so much will make it obviously lunchtime over here in the US? Do you think it'll be pay-per-view on ESPN?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, if they're worried about recouping funds, usually promoters then they resort to pay-per-view, right? Because they can get more money immediately back from the consumer to do that.
Right.
But if it is an afternoon offering, that is another thing to consider. Do they just worry about trying to get big sponsorship dollars and put this on ESPN and worry about the commercials they can sell, the branding they can get on the ring, and go at it that way? That's another way to attack it. But if it does wind up being an afternoon offering, that might change their strategy a little bit. If this were a nighttime thing, I think they put it on pay-per-view no matter what. But yeah, if this is a UK fight, if it's in a UK stadium, I think that changes things.
What do you think? Do you think it would be UK? I mean, I'm just going UK, 2 UK fighters. Dillian Whyte's not massively known over here. So you just think that it would sell more in the UK. Easter time, weather should be okay. Stick it in like either Cardiff because it has a roof. Stick it in the UK at Wembley Stadium, maybe. Get somewhere between 80 to 100,000 fans. Pay-per-view on BT. And then, like you said, maybe just free to air on ESPN, or maybe a very small pay-per-view on ESPN, because it's going to be really the wrong time of year, and wrong time of day.
Yeah.
In April, what sports do we have going on in the US? Baseball.
Yeah, but baseball might not even start by then, because there's a lockout going on, so baseball might not be happening. Hockey is just kind of winding down, and you would have NBA playoffs, I guess. So you would have some competition, but not the kind of competition that you would really have to avoid. I wouldn't think, like regular season baseball or the later stages of hockey are not things that promoters are worried about avoiding. Yeah, I mean, just playing kind of armchair promoter here. I mean, the factors you're considering are, are you better off going to a UK stadium where, let's say, you can sell 80,000 tickets? What does that equal? As opposed to maybe a site fee from a Vegas casino and the massive markup that you can put on tickets in Las Vegas. Which one helps give you more money? Like, kind of selfishly as a fan, I just love the stadium atmosphere. I love watching fights that are in stadiums. It gets me excited even when I'm not there. So I would love to see it, but that may not be what's financially best for the promotion, especially as we've been talking about with what the overhead of this fight is. It's hard to say what would be better. Oftentimes, if you do have I think more often than not, if you get a Vegas casino offer and can price your ringside seats the way that you can in Vegas, that tends to make those gates tend to be higher than even the biggest stadium fights. So, but it's a question of whether an American venue would put in that kind of bid for a Dillian Whyte fight. This isn't Deontay Wilder. Like, you don't have an American challenger who's known here. This is Dillian Whyte. How does that change things? That'll be interesting to see how this shakes out.
Yeah, it is interesting. As soon as I saw how big the bid was, I was just like, how on earth are they going to recoup that? And it's funny how us as fans and stuff like that even think about that. It's not our money, but it's just intriguing to know, I guess.
I know. Well, and to loop this all the way back to the beginning of our of our conversation, a lot of boxing discourse tends to be about this, right? It's kind of like business speculation all the time, more so than like, hey, let's talk about the X's and O's of Tyson Fury and Dillian Whyte. And there are obvious reasons why this is fascinating for fans, because of the money that's involved. But oftentimes that is kind of the what we not resort to, but that's kind of the baseline discourse in boxing, is just sort of, like playing business people and playing armchair promoter, as opposed to kind of talking about the stories of the fighters and what's happening between the ropes.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting just to try to work it out and see, where they're going to go. I just wonder as well, with that amount of money going to the main event, I'm guessing the rest of the card's going to be a mishmash of unknowns as well.
Yeah. I mean, that tends to, but and this always comes up, and the reality is that when you have major fights like this that are on pay-per-view, like, I don't know how much evidence there is that a stacked undercard actually influences buys when you have a major headline. Like, if this were a mid-tier pay-per-view and people are like, I don't know if I need to pay $80 for this, that's when, a good look, you have a couple title fights and a stacked undercard might actually help. But if you have a Canelo, a Tyson Fury, if you have your sport's major players at the top, it doesn't typically, I think, make business like a difference financially to stack that undercard, both because for the promoter, you might wind up losing money because of the purses you might add to that. But I also don't know that it actually, for the people who are going to buy this fight or not, I don't know that having, another, like, whatever, a cruiserweight title fight on the undercard makes a difference to that person, whether they actually order it or not. So it's something that fans always talk about, but I don't know that at the top level actually makes a difference. And that's unfortunate, but that's kind of what we've been conditioned to pay for and to accept as fans.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting as well, whether ESPN will go with a pay-per-view to try to recoup, some of that purse.
Right. And if they don't, then they really only need to worry about like one undercard fight and then the Fury fight, right? And that's and then the undercard is basically on ESPN Plus, and they don't have to worry about it quite as much.
Yeah. Talking about pay-per-views, Oscar De La Hoya said recently in an interview, a rematch with Floyd Mayweather could easily generate 5 million pay-per-views. Do you agree, Corey?
5 million? No, I don't think it would. I certainly wouldn't easily draw 5 million, but I also don't think it would draw 5 million. I mean, I think we saw. I mean, Tyson versus Roy Jones is a good kind of litmus test for this, right? And what did that do? Let's call it 1.4. One to change. That I think had way more curiosity than what Mayweather and De La Hoya would have right now, because Tyson coming back, like, that's way more of a novelty for fans, and that's what this is. This is a novelty. We recently saw Mayweather in a novelty bout like this, and by all accounts, it did like 1 million pay-per-views, which is still a monstrous number, more than basically every other fighter in boxing can draw on pay-per-view. Floyd Mayweather in a gimmicky exhibition fight, but I don't think that he's capable of doing 5 million, even if it's against De La Hoya. I just don't see that being the case, because I happen to know roughly kind of what the ticket sales were looking like when De La Hoya was supposed to come back at Staples Center, and they weren't that great. So I don't think that points to 5 million people wanting to buy that fight.
Do you think it's just Oscar trying to grab headlines, or do you think there's any chance that we could see, De La Hoya v Mayweather 2?
Well, I think he is trying to grab headlines because it might, create some kind of demand for this fight. And I'm sure he does want that fight. And whether he believes he can get 5 million buys or not is kind of inconsequential. He's worried about getting that fight, because he does seem genuinely interested and curious about getting back in the fight. But he would get paid for that fight too. So yeah, I think it's a headlines grabbing thing. Every 4 months, Oscar says something like this about either wanting a Mayweather rematch, or he wants to fight Canelo, or he wants to come back, or he is coming back. Like, Oscar does this, and I think to a certain degree he does mean it, but and he might even believe that he could get 5 million pay-per-views, but I just think he's wrong about that.
Just something to keep himself relevant as such.
For sure. And every time that he says something like that, if you're a newspaper reporter and you're writing about it, you might also drop in like, hey, De La Hoya is also promoting this event coming up. And so some of it is him leveraging his own fame to help promote, the fighters that he has under his umbrella. That's looking at it charitably. But some of it is Oscar, he's a very famous person who I think enjoys being famous, and the fruits that come with that.
Last one before I let you go. Obviously, we're talking about Oscar, who is the obviously owner of Golden Boy. Ryan Garcia posted today, back in camp, ready for April. Any rumors on who you think he may be fighting?
Well, I know he wants to fight George Kambosos, but I haven't seen any evidence that is actually moving forward. I've also heard rumors of maybe Tevin Farmer being an opponent for Ryan Garcia. I think that's very possible. But I'm really not sure which way that Garcia is going to go. And what's interesting about Garcia is that he's kind of the draw in almost any fight that he could possibly make. Even if he's not the title holder, like, he's the one with the bigger audience, and he's the one, I think, the broadcaster, in this case DAZN, cares about most. In Garcia is kind of, in terms of American draws for DAZN, during that era, like, he was only second to Canelo. I think he might have even outdrawn AJ in certain fights. Like, for DAZN, he's very, very important. So he's the draw in whatever situation he's in. And that also makes him alluring to people like Kambosos. Like, I don't know if that fight is actually going to happen. I think that Kambosos would take some heat for not fighting, either Haney or Lomachenko or Gervonta, and fighting Ryan instead. But the audience that Garcia brings and the potential ratings keeps him in this conversation. So Garcia kind of has the ability to fight whoever he wants. And could I see him kind of wedging himself into a major fight like that? Potentially. But also he can kind of fight whoever and is going to do pretty good ratings. So I really have no read on which way he's going to go, but he's a very intriguing draw and an intriguing character in boxing, right?
Yeah, he is. I did wonder whether, with all the stuff that he's been through, whether he was going to come back and have a little bit of a softer touch, just to kind of get himself back into the ring, and then move on to something bigger down the line. I get the feeling with Ryan, just from on the outside looking in, I don't think we're going to see him for long. I think he's going to have a short career and he'll end up doing something else.
Yeah, which is it's totally fine, and he's already kind of dipping his toes in a lot of different things. He had a sitcom on YouTube. He's got some good endorsements, and he has a following that is very much outside of boxing, and that following doesn't necessarily care who he fights next. They just want to see Ryan Garcia fight. Like he's kind of like if Jake Paul were an actual world title contender, right? They kind of exist sort of in the same space and function in the same way. I think Paul is a bigger draw than Garcia, obviously, but yeah, I think Ryan seems to be carving a niche for himself as a streamer and as a YouTuber and as an Instagram celebrity. I mean, he probably gets paid a lot of money for anything he posts on Instagram, and that's a lot less burdensome on your body than going in there and actually fighting. So yeah, I agree with you when you say he has a short career, and when I say that, I mean there is nothing ill towards Ryan Garcia in saying that. I think that it's great that he has the option to do that, and if he wants to do that, good for him. I think it's if any fighter can get out with their faculties and be able to be profitable after they hang up their gloves, I applaud anyone who can do that.
I appreciate your time today, Corey. If you want to just tell everyone where they can find you on Instagram and Twitter, and any shows you have working coming up, or any projects.
Yeah, for sure. So as I said, I'm going to be hosting this weekend's Claressa Shields pay-per-view and the Eubank Williams pay-per-view on ppv.com and on Fight, so you can catch me on there. Gonna have a couple shows coming up. I believe I'm going to be calling Makhmudov and Marius Wach coming up in a couple weeks in Montreal as well. I may be doing something with the Thurman Barrios pay-per-view as well. I can't announce anything, but I might have some involvement in that too. So I'm going to be popping up everywhere on broadcasts as usual. Writing-wise, you can find me every Monday on boxingscene.com, writing the lead story there. And I'm on Twitter at Corey_Erdman. Feel free to follow me there for everything I have going on.
One more just before we let you go. If if anyone's listening, any young person that's a wannabe, sports journalist, and they've listened to you and obviously, the stuff that you've done at your age and stuff like that, what type of advice would you give them to get to where you are?
Yeah. Well, I would say, make sure that you are reading a lot, that you're consuming a lot, learn from the people who are the best at these particular jobs, and make sure, if you want to be a boxing writer, that's great, but make sure that you're reading people that are outside of this realm. Read books, read people who are reporting on other things, and develop your own style. It's a very crowded space to just walk into boxing, let's say, and be like a newsbreaker, right? That's very difficult. And there's only a handful of people who can do that because they have the outlets that people go to for the breaking news. So find your own niche and find your own voice and cultivate it however you can. And that means, not just reading the voices that are within boxing, read things that are outside of it. As far as becoming a boxing broadcaster, it's really a DIY profession. You can go to broadcast school if you want, or you don't, but you still have to be willing to put in the work to make yourself a better broadcaster. And whether that's just sitting at home and calling your own fights, whether that's calling up local promoters and finding a way to be a commentator on their streams. The good thing about today's landscape is that, as we talked about before, earlier on this show, there's more boxing being broadcast than ever before. Every weekend, there's probably 40 shows being streamed somewhere in the world, and someone's got to call all of them. And so with a little bit of hustle, you can find a way to get yourself out there and to get yourself some good reps and to get yourself some practice. And when you do that, do your best to tell the stories of these people. These are, in my experience, some of the most fascinating characters as far as athletes in the world. Boxers are probably the most accessible high-level athletes in the world. You can walk into a gym anywhere and interact with world champions. You can't just walk into the Cleveland Browns facility and go talk to Baker Mayfield or whatever. Like this, you have the tools within boxing to be very, very curious and to be very, very thorough as a reporter and as a commentator. And my advice is to always use as many of them as you possibly can. And I think you can go a long way.
That's some great advice. And with, podcasts and YouTube, you can kind of get yourself like a platform where you can kind of sell yourself as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's an open market, but also don't burn yourself out working for free either. Definitely know your worth, and don't let yourself be taken advantage of. And, for anyone that wants to break into this industry, either as a writer or as a broadcaster, my DMs are always open if you want to reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk to people and mentor young people coming into this.
Some good advice. That's some good advice. And you can find us at The Last Round 12 on Instagram and Twitter. And be sure to join us next week. We'll be reviewing all the fights we spoke about and previewing the Daniel Jacobs against John Ryder card. This is The Last Round.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is the Last Round Podcast.